What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up another top 10 decks of the week. And this time, we are actually looking at the top decks in the game. I looked over every single deck I possibly could on Play Limitless TCG to get the win rates and the meta shares of all decks, how often they're topping, and actually how often they are winning. And so this is the list I came up with starting with deck number 10, which is Charizard Moltres. This deck is still super duper strong and is still winning tournaments. However, it does have a below par win rate right now. The overall win rate is only about a 49%, pretty close to 50%, but it does have the third, I believe, highest meta share in the game with about 8%. This deck, even though overall has below 50% win rate, it is still winning and topping tournaments. In fact, it actually won the Ursi Day tournament this week. The past week, the one that just happened, I think it was around 1,700 people, and so it's still very strong. And not only is it strong because it has obviously 200 attack on Charizard, and there are a lot of things in the game like giant capes that help Pokemon get up to certain high HPs. Charizard can still hit around all of that stuff, and since Pokemon Communications and Dawn came out, it made this deck a lot more consistent, especially when you combine things like X-Speed on your Moltres that has multiple energies. You can just retreat it and then use a Dawn and then hit around anything with your Charizard, so it's still very strong, even more consistent as it used to be. Not the best win rate, a very high meta share, and that is why it's in the top 10 list as number 10, because it has below 50% win rate, but is still winning tournaments and has a humongous meta share. With that being said, let's get into deck number 9. So this is number 9, and it's the Rampardos Lucario deck. This deck is still doing pretty decent. It's a fossil deck that has a pretty high ceiling, if I'm being honest. 130 with Rampardos is already insane for just one energy. Add on a Lucario, that's 150. Add 2 Lucario, that is 170. If you were to mix in things like Rocky Helmets and Giovanni's in this deck, it would make it even stronger. But this deck has only about a 1% meta share, but has a 53% win rate, which is absolutely huge. And over this past week, it has saw at least 2 tops in tournaments, so that is very good, considering all of the decks not on the list, even if they made more tops, have such a much lower win rate that they did not make the top 10s list for this week. Now, there are a couple of versions of this deck. There actually are ones that don't play Lucario at all, and those decks are also doing pretty well. Not as well as this one, but honestly, I kind of agree with no Lucario sometimes, because actually doing 130 can sometimes, it might not one-shot everything, but even if you don't one-shot something, considering it's a single prize deck and you're hitting for 130 and not damaging yourself because you didn't knock anything out, it doesn't really matter all that much. I am surprised to see that there is no Shadow, considering you do damage on yourself if you knock something out. So I would like to see a Shadow in this deck, and I'm sure there are versions that do play it. In fact, I actually built a deck that is just fossils, and I play a Chatot in the front. It's actually really strong. I did tremendously well with it, so go check that out on my YouTube if you feel like it. This deck is actually really strong. Any single prize deck that can output this much damage and only give up 1 prize at a time is going to do pretty well, as long as you know how to play the deck. But again, this made number 9 because it has a 53% win rate. That's honestly the truth about it. 53% is on the upper end of good decks right now, and it's still seeing tops, whereas some decks that are below 52 or less, I didn't even put on this list unless they won a tournament, like Charizard and Moltres. So this deck is very strong and does a lot for you as a single prize deck. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 8. So this is deck number 8, and it's the Dialga Yanmega EX deck with Mew EX in the deck to kind of give it that little bit of extra oomph in the end, or when you have those matchups with very large attackers whose attacks you can copy with Mew EX. This deck only plays 6 basics and 2 evolutions, so a total of 7 Pokemon. So sorry, 5 basics and 2 evolutions. This allows you to put a ton of different cards in your deck to have a bunch of options. As you can see, the player, I took the best deck of the week of this deck, and this player is playing 3 items or tool cards, 2 Giant Cape and a Rocky Helmet. It's also playing a Giovanni to get that extra bit of power when you need it to hit those breakpoints. It has a potion to fix a breakpoint. Obviously, Professor's Research and Pokeball to Leaf, which makes sense because you want to be able to get the Dialga out of the front when you want to bring in either a Yanmega or a Mew. And then 1 Cyrus, 1 Sabrina. This is something you'll see often. It's a split, so you can have the decision to play either or when you need to play them. So this deck does have a 52% win rate, a 2% meta share, and it has seen at least 3 tops in very large tournaments with 256 or more people in the past week. In fact, there are some decks you're not going to see on here that you think you would, like Palkia EX Vaporeon did not make the list. The new Magnezone Hitmonlee deck that was a huge star last week did not make it. It's actually being replaced by another Magnezone deck, and the reasons they didn't make the deck is because they are actually below a 52% win rate, have less tops overall than all decks on this list, and did not win any single tournament with 256 or more people. But with that being said, let's get into deck number 7. This is deck number 7. It's the second deck with grass type Pokemon in it, and it's honestly very, very strong. In fact, all decks are really grass decks, I should say, are very strong right now. There are a lot of Darkrai decks or just dark decks in general. I mean, basically Darkrai is one of those cards that's played in almost everything, almost like a Magnezone being played in everything right now. So it makes sense that Magnezone Darkrai is still one of like the top 3 decks. But these types of decks with grass type Pokemon that could do very good damage, either very good early damage or very good late damage, helps to kind of counter those decks. First of all, Exeggutor EX for just 1 energy at the beginning of the game can do up to 100 damage on any dark Pokemon. New dark Pokemon, things like Weavile, Darkrai, or Spiritomb. And then Yanmega can actually one-shot a Darkrai or a Weavile on board as so long as they don't have a giant cape attached to them because they are weak to grass. So we just saw the Dialga Yanmega. Now we see an Exeggutor Yanmega, and I do believe this is the better version. I always thought it was, and I do think the stats represent that. They actually have the exact same amount of meta share. They have the exact same amount of tops this week in 256 or more player tournaments, but this does have a 2% higher win rate, and so I do believe this deck is better. In fact, I think any deck right now that's playing a very good deck with Exeggutor EX is the best version of that deck. Exeggutor EX is like an MVP this season. It's super duper strong. First of all, it already has 160 and can have a ceiling of 100 damage on dark Pokemon that are weak to grass. But with a giant cape, it also goes up to 180 or a Rocky Helmet, allowing you to get that little bit of extra damage to really hit breakpoints when you're attacking into something that's really hard to knock out already is super duper valuable. So I do love this deck. This is my favorite grass deck of the season, but it's only deck number 7. But with that being said, let's get into deck number 6. So this is deck number 6, and this is actually, I just talked about my favorite grass type deck of the season. This is actually my overall favorite deck of the season. This is one of those decks where I'm sure everybody falls victim to this, where they think they come up with a deck and then they play it, but then they realize everybody else is already playing it as well. That kind of happened to me where I made this deck and in my head I'm like, oh my god, I just made a super cool deck, and then I put it into a tournament, and lo and behold, a whole bunch of people have already played it in tournaments, and a whole bunch of people were playing it in that tournament, and then by the time I posted this video, I think a couple of other content creators had posted it too, but I absolutely love this deck, and this deck number 6 has a 5% meta share, a 54% win rate, and has topped in at least 4 tournaments this week with 256 or more people. And so this deck is still doing very good. Of course, it's doing very good because it's combining Greninja, Darkrai, and Druddigon all in one deck, because all these cards allow you to get free value, basically free damage. Anytime someone attacks into a Druddigon, free damage. Every time you attach an energy to Darkrai, free damage. Anytime you finally get Greninja on board, you hit the ability, free damage. In my version, I played 2 Druddigon. This version is playing 1 Druddigon and 1 Kangaskhan. I've seen this a little bit more lately because if you start with a Kangaskhan, what happens is you get to do a ton of early game damage, sometimes more than what you would get out of the Druddigon. And then I also played Rocky Helmets to get that little bit more, but it did seem to be a mistake. The decks that were doing better at the time were playing potions instead. Now I think people are starting to play giant capes because Darkrai already gets one-shotted by yanmega. It has to play a giant cape to fix that breakpoint. But this deck is super duper strong. It's super duper fun, and I think it's the most unique deck out there right now that combines a whole bunch of kind of types together. This one's already playing 4 different types. It's not really a dark deck. It's not really a water deck. It's not really a dragon deck. It's not a colorless deck. It's a super duper well put together deck, and it's still doing very well enough to get number 6 on this list this week. But with that being said, let's get into deck number 5. So this is deck number 5. That's right, a 18 trainer deck, and it's the Pachirisu version of the deck. The Articuno, push it aside, never talk about it again. It's nothing compared to this deck. And honestly, you would think that the Pachirisu Pikachu deck would be doing a lot better because it's still very strong, still very aggressive. But this deck is doing super duper well. Only a 1% meta share, but guess what? A 54% win rate and 6 tops at least in tournaments this past week with 256 or more people. This deck allows you to play as many trainer cards as you possibly can in a deck. I mean, obviously you can play 19 in one, but it's not a smart thing to do. So of course you're able to play a bunch of tool cards, because of your tool cards you want to be able to attach onto your Pachirisu as early as possible. I probably in my head would want to be playing 6. This deck is only playing 5, and I think most are, and maybe it's the right thing to do if most decks are doing it. This deck allows you to play 2 Sabrina, 2 Cyrus, which is already super duper valuable. It plays a blue, which is really smart because you really do need to make sure this card stays online as long as possible. So of course the Giant Capes is 2 of the tool cards that you're playing, as well as potions. I'm honestly wouldn't even be opposed to put in a second blue. The red card in Mars is really to kind of control your opponent. Red card probably for the early game to kind of slow them down, and then Mars for the late game to slow them down even more. Obviously, Professor's Research and Pokeball. Pokeball for sure, I guess. Do we even need to play it? I mean, it's probably valuable, but there's probably some times where it's also just a dead card. One of them will be dead, but I honestly would like to see probably a 6th item or a tool. I keep calling them items. 6th tool, and maybe even a second blue, because you really do want your Pachirisus to stay online, because you only have 2 and they only have 120 HP, and some of them that you're playing in the games, certain games will not have giant capes on them because you need to get that damage value early on, and if you only have a Rocky Helmet or a Loomberry, then you might not be able to keep it online for as long as you possibly want. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 4. So this is deck number 4. It's the Exeggutor EX Mew EX deck. There is a better version of this deck, and we'll get into it later. However, I do like this version as well. This version I like because I do like taking in the Mew EX. The Mew EX, you can basically use it whenever you need to. So basically in certain games, the games where you don't need to, you just don't put it down. You don't make it a risky hit to get either Cyrus or Sabrina. It only has 130 HP, so if you're not going to get value out of its attack, you should not be putting it down unless you absolutely have to. But this deck allows you to play, again, like the yanmega build, a ton of different trainers in the deck, even more because because we're only playing 6 Pokemon total in this deck, 4 basics, 2 evolutions. The communications in this deck very much do allow you to get into that Exeggutor EX. Because you're playing such minimum Pokemon, it actually increases your chances of communications hitting the way you want it. However, I honestly don't think you need them, at least not at 2. I think this deck would be better served with other cards, either a second Giant Cape, a Rocky Helmet, or more Gust cards. I think the best versions of these decks actually play more Gust cards. I think they play a minimum of 3, either 2 Sabrina or 1 Cyrus, or 2 Cyrus and 1 Sabrina. But this deck anyways is still doing very good. Again, 2% win rate, 54% win rate, 2% meta share, and 1 tournament win this past week with 256 or more people. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 3. So this is deck number 3, and it's the Darkrai Magnezone deck, and this deck is still doing super duper strong. In fact, some might consider this the best deck in the game on this list. It is the one with the highest win rate with 55%, and it has the second highest meta share with 9%. So you might be wondering why it's only number 3 this week, because it only won 1 tournament, whereas the other decks on the list have won more. So this deck is still super duper strong. It did used to win a lot more tournaments in the last 2 weeks before that. Now it only won 1 week with one tournament with 256 or more people this past week, but this deck is still super duper strong. It traditionally ran 2 Druddigon, and then people started playing Druddigon and Kangaskhan. Now they are running 2 Kangaskhan, or at least this deck is, and I kind of like the idea because, one, you can definitely get a lot more value out of a Kangaskhan, especially if you're flipping those coins. Even if you get just 1 heads, guess what? You're hitting for 30. And you can also turn it into a Druddigon by just putting 1 of your 2 Rocky Helmets on it, or a Giant Cape to keep it online for even longer, and then make up for those points that were getting hit by a Rocky Helmet or not having a Druddigon by getting more attacks. In this deck builds itself. Literally, you play your Kangaskhan in the front. Once you put 1 energy on it, you don't have to put any more energy on it at all, and you only have to use a leaf to get it out like you would use on the Druddigon anyways, and then you just focus the rest of your energies on Darkrai and slowly build up your Magnezone in the back by itself. Of course, you can attach some Darks energies on Magnezone if you need to, or if you feel like you're able to do it, but it's not always necessary. This deck is also playing not just the Rocky Helmet, but a Giant Cape, and it's also playing a split, which is often seen in many decks right now, between Cyrus and Sabrina at 1 and 1. I would like to maybe see 2 Leafs in this deck, but and maybe 1 Rocky Helmet, but I guess the some players only want to play the 1 Leaf. It really is maybe only to get your one-time Kangaskhan out of the front if you're able to, and if not, then it doesn't matter, I guess. But I'm not really sure, because every single Pokemon, your Magnezone's 2, your Darkrai's 2, and your Kangaskhan is 3. So I really would think this deck would benefit from 2 Leafs, but maybe not. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 2, a brand new deck on the scene. Really, really cool. So this is the new deck, and of course, a Magnezone deck. Magnezone is being played everywhere, but so is Darkrai. So of course, Darkrai Magnezone would be one of the best decks in the game, but this deck is a new deck on the scene, at least from my point of view. Maybe it was out the week before, but it really did tremendous this week, which is why it got the number 2 spot on the top 10 decks of the week. It's a Magnezone Skarmory deck with 1 Heatran. It has a 3% meta share, a 54% win rate, and won 2 tournaments in its first really big week of the meta, and it's doing super duper well. So, of course, as your lead Pokemon, instead of something like a Druddigon or a Kangaskhan, we're playing something like a Skarmory. This deck, as I said before, it kind of replaced the Hitmonlee version of the deck, and it's just because I think it's a lot more aggressive, and you're going to get a lot more value out of a Skarmory than you really would something like a Hitmonlee or a Hitmonchan anyways. Yes, Hitmonchan does hit for 50 against Magnezone, and Magnezone is everywhere right now, but so does Skarmory. It has the same amount of HP, except once it has a tool card on it, you're going to be attacking for that 50 damage. You are playing 3, so it might be the better version of the deck, and it seems to be the better version right now. This deck also plays a Heatran, which is super duper surprising. What a sleeper card this card might be, but this deck is really cool. And of course, because Magnezone builds itself, you only have to place Steel Energy, so that you can just put one on your Skarmory and then the rest on Heatran. So maybe this deck is the new deck on of the meta of Magnezone this week. Maybe it'll get replaced by something else. Who knows? Like I said, first it was Magnezone Darkrai, then Magnezone Greninja started rising up a bit. Darkrai, Magnezone stayed up there, so did Greninja, but then Magnezone Hitmonlee came in, and now it seems to be dropping off. We'll see if this one stays on or drops off, but it actually won the second most tournaments this week in 256 or more player tournaments, so very, very, very good. But with that being said, let's get into deck number 1. So this is deck number 1, and you might be saying we already looked at this deck, and it's because we kind of did, because it was the Exeggutor EX Mew EX deck, but this is the one that does not play Mew EX, and this version of the deck is only called Exeggutor EX Celebi EX because obviously no Mew, but this has a 8% bigger meta share and has a 54% win rate. So the 54% win rate is the same win rate as the Mew EX deck, but has an 8% higher meta share, and the Mew EX deck only won 1 tournament this week, whereas this deck won 6. And this deck won more tournaments by far than any other deck in tournaments with 256 or more people. I also noticed it seems to be topping a lot more than any other deck. If you go on playlimitlesstcg.com and you go into all the tournaments for Pokemon Pocket over the last 7 days, or even previous to that, because by the time you watch this, it might be more days past, but you'll see when you look on tops of all tournaments, you just see grass. You see Exeggutor everywhere, Exeggutor Celebi, Exeggutor Mew, Exeggutor yanmega. You see Exeggutor everywhere, and that's why I was saying he's like an MVP. He's just super duper strong. This deck only plays 5 Pokemon. The yanmega build played 7, the Mew EX played 6, this plays 5. So it really does seem, and people have said this forever, the 18 trainer card decks are going to get stronger the more cards come out. And this might be proof of that as well, because this is playing the least amount of Pokemon possible to make a deck very good, which is Exeggutor EX as a massive tank. So you almost automatically, you have a 66% chance of starting with your Execute over the Celebi because you're playing 2 over 1. And then you're able to play a ton of other cards. You can play Giant Capes, you can play Rocky Helmets, you can play Ericas to make sure your Exeggutor EX play stays online, and also increase the damage output that you're going to be doing with Exeggutor EX. And then once Celebi comes in, you don't even need the Superior anymore. The Superior is way too slow. I said this last week or the week before. Superior decks are just too slow now. It's all about aggressive burst damage, trying to get as much damage in as you possibly can at the beginning of the game, and then if you need that big game sweeper like Celebi to come in and just take everything out, that's exactly what you're going to be able to do. And as I said as well, these versions of the decks, these better versions of these decks, play 3 Gust cards, 2 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus. And so I honestly think this deck is super strong. And not only that, but you're able to play Potions, Ericas, and Giant Capes all in the same deck. This deck is never going... These Pokemon are very hard to get knocked out. It's actually super insane how long these cards can stay on board without ever being knocked out, especially the Exeggutor EX. So anyways, with that being said, that is it for the top 10 decks of the week. I hope you liked it. This is based off stats. This isn't really based off my opinion, so don't shoot the messenger. I'm just doing the stats. As I said, no Palkia EX, no Vaporeon decks, no Magnezone Hitmonlee, and no Bastiodon. There are some decks that didn't make it that I would have liked to have put on, but their stats just weren't as good as the stats that we're looking at currently. But that might completely change next week when I do another top 10 list, as I do this every single week, and I do post videos every day. So be sure to hit that notification bell, leave a comment in the comment section below, like, subscribe, and share, and as always, keep cooking.